An Australian journalist sat down with India's external affairs minister, ready to fire off one loaded question after another. Questions built on the assumption that India owes the West an explanation, that India must justify every choice it makes on the world stage. Within minutes, that assumption falls apart. Subramanyam Jaishankar doesn't get defensive. He doesn't dodge. He simply answers every question with facts the journalist wasn't ready for. And by the end of the interview, she is the one struggling to keep up. To understand why this interview mattered so much, it helps to understand the man sitting across from the microphone. Subramanyam Jaishankar is not a career politician who stumbled into diplomacy. He is a career diplomat who became a politician. Before he ever held a ministerial post, he had already served as India's foreign secretary, India's ambassador to the United States, and India's ambassador to China. Few people in the world understand the psychology of Washington and Beijing as deeply as he does. This background matters because it explains why, when Western journalists try the old trick of undermining India, Jaishankar simply does not blink. He has seen this trick before. He has seen it played on Indian diplomats for decades, a subtle assumption that India's foreign policy choices need Western approval before they can be considered legitimate. Here, the Australian broadcaster sat down with him expecting a docile guest. Instead, they got a masterclass in strategic clarity. The interview starts with a question about India's relationship with Russia. Many Western countries are uncomfortable with this relationship. The journalist suggests that it is a problem for Australia, which is part of the Quad with India, the United States, and Japan. The question carries an assumption that India should always stand with the West and that having close ties with Russia needs to be justified. Jaishankar does not accept that idea. Instead, he asks the interviewer to look at it from India's point of view. If India's friendship with Russia is seen as a problem, then shouldn't India's concerns about the West's long relationship with Pakistan also be taken seriously? For decades, the United States and other Western countries have worked closely with Pakistan, yet they are rarely asked to explain that relationship, even though India has faced cross-border terrorism linked to Pakistan. His point is simple. The West sees its own partnerships as normal, but questions India's partnerships when they don't match Western interests. Jaishankar then talks about Russian oil. After the Ukraine war began, India continued buying discounted oil from Russia. Many people criticize this decision, but he argues that India's purchases help keep global energy supplies stable. If countries like India had stopped buying Russian oil completely, prices could have risen even higher, making inflation worse around the world, including in Europe and North America. Jaishankar explains that India has kept good relations with both Russia and Ukraine. Because of this, India is one of the few countries that can speak to both sides. That is not a weakness, he says. It is a strength. If peace is ever achieved, it will require countries that can talk to everyone, not just one side. This idea that lasting peace comes through dialogue and diplomacy, not only through military action, becomes one of the central messages by India. Pressed on how the Ukraine war might end, Jaishankar offers a view shaped by decades of watching global conflicts unfold. Wars, he explains, are almost never resolved on the battlefield. They are resolved at the negotiating table. The only real question is how much destruction happens before both sides finally agree to sit down. It is a quietly powerful statement because it reframes India's position. India is deliberately preserving its ability to talk to everyone so that when the moment for negotiation finally arrives, there is at least one major power still trusted by both sides. Western media rarely frames India's neutrality this way. It is far easier for a headline to accuse India of sitting on the fence than to explain the deeper strategic logic behind that choice. Jaishankar's answer quietly dismantles that lazy narrative. The journalist then raises the idea of a new axis forming in the world. Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, drawing closer together since the war in Ukraine began. It is framed as a growing threat that the West must confront. Jaishankar's response carries real weight. He points out that this alignment has grown stronger precisely because the war has dragged on. The longer the conflict continues, the more these countries are pushed toward each other, and the more unpredictable the consequences become for everyone, including for Western nations that consider themselves untouched by the war. His conclusion is simple but sharp. If the West is truly worried about this growing alignment among rival powers, then the strongest thing it can do is help bring the war to an end sooner rather than later. Continuing to fuel the conflict indefinitely does not weaken this new axis. It strengthens it. Once again, India is positioned not as a bystander, but as one of the few responsible voices in the room. Now comes one of the most important moments of the entire conversation. The journalist tries to pull India into a hypothetical war scenario, asking whether India would support the United States militarily if China were to invade Taiwan. It is a classic media trap. Answer yes, and India appears to be abandoning its long-standing policy of strategic independence, dragging itself into a potential war it never agreed to fight. Answer no, and headlines around the world would scream that India is unreliable, that the Quad partnership means nothing when it matters most. Jaishankar refuses to fall into either trap. He calmly corrects the entire premise of the question. The Quad, he explains, was never designed as a military alliance in the way NATO is. It is a partnership of 4 countries working together on shared interests: technology, infrastructure, maritime security, and regional stability. It was never built as a mutual defense treaty like the ones the United States has with Japan or Australia. Asking India to commit troops to a hypothetical war over Taiwan misunderstands what the Quad actually is. Then he adds the line that truly reframes the entire debate. India is the only member of the Quad that shares an actual land border with China. India has stood eye to eye with Chinese soldiers along a real, physical frontier for decades. India understands the reality of dealing with China in a way that Australia, sitting safely across an ocean, simply does not. It is a reminder that India does not need lessons on China from countries thousands of kilometers away from the actual border. The conversation then shifts to technology, and here Jaishankar delivers one of the most quietly devastating points of the entire interview. The journalist brings up India's ban on TikTok, framing it almost as a badge of honor. Proof that India can resist Chinese technological influence. Jaishankar agrees, but then turns the question into a mirror pointed directly back at the West. He explains that India's decision was rooted in 2 concerns: security sensitivities around a platform capable of collecting enormous amounts of user data, and a broader principle about data sovereignty. If people are truly concerned about protecting their personal data, that concern cannot be selective. Data protection cannot apply only to certain apps in certain countries while being ignored everywhere else. Once personal data leaves a country's legal jurisdiction, there is no guarantee it will be protected with the same seriousness, regardless of which country is collecting it. The message is unmistakable, even though Jaishankar never says it outright. The West loves to lecture the world about Chinese data collection, while quietly running its own vast surveillance and data harvesting systems across the globe for years. India banned TikTok out of genuine national security concern. The question left hanging in the air is whether Western governments can honestly claim the same moral high ground on data privacy that they demand from everyone else. When asked directly whether Australia should also ban the app, Jaishankar declines to lecture another sovereign nation. He simply states that every government must decide for itself what is best for its own citizens. It is a small line, but it carries a large point. India does not go around telling other nations how to run their affairs, unlike so many Western capitals that regularly do exactly that to countries like India. The interview moves into a broader discussion about international rules, maritime law, trade dependency, and economic coercion. Jaishankar's answer here captures the entire spirit of India's modern foreign policy. He explains that in a globalized world, every nation depends on others for trade, technology, and investment. That interdependence is healthy as long as it stays within the boundaries of fair economics. The moment economic ties are weaponized, turned into pressure points used to punish a country for a political decision, trust breaks down and nations begin to hedge against each other. He references India's own experience settling maritime disputes with neighboring countries, even when the outcomes were not entirely favorable to India, simply because international law had to be respected. It is a subtle but powerful contrast. India accepts unfavorable rulings when the rules say so. Does everyone play by the same standard? The journalist then raises China's punishing trade tariffs against Australia, imposed after Australia's former government called for an independent inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. Jaishankar does not defend China's actions. Instead, he uses the moment to make a much larger point about the world order itself, that when economic relationships are used as political weapons, it forces every nation, including powerful ones like the United States under its current leadership, to rethink how dependent it wants to be on any single trading partner. It is a masterclass in diplomatic communication. Jaishankar never directly criticizes Australia or personally attacks the journalist. He stays calm, speaks respectfully, and avoids emotional language. Instead of making accusations, he asks questions and uses comparisons that encourage the audience to think about the issue from a different perspective. His message is always clear. Every country, including India, has the right to make foreign policy decisions based on its own national interests. This approach is one of the reasons Jaishankar is widely regarded as an effective diplomat. He does not rely on anger or dramatic statements. He lets facts, logic, and carefully chosen examples carry the argument. The conversation then turns toward the Middle East, or as Jaishankar rightly calls, West Asia, a region India refuses to view through a purely Western lens, precisely because it matters so directly to Indian interests. He lays out the numbers plainly. Around 9 million Indians live and work in the region. A significant share of India's energy imports flows from there. Several of India's largest trading partners sit inside that region. Key global shipping and connectivity routes pass directly through it. For India, West Asia is not a distant geopolitical chessboard. It is a matter of daily economic and human reality. Jaishankar reveals that India strongly supported the Abraham Accords, the normalization agreements between Israel and several Arab nations, and remains deeply invested in ambitious infrastructure projects like the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, a project designed to link Indian ports to European markets through a chain of Gulf and Mediterranean partnerships. When pressed on Iran's nuclear program, Jaishankar reaffirms India's clear position. Nations that sign international non-proliferation treaties must honor their commitments, and there are consequences when they don't. But when the journalist tries to push him into endorsing a military strike on Iranian nuclear facilities, Jaishankar firmly declines to be drawn into that scenario. His answer here is perhaps the most philosophically important moment of the entire interview. He states plainly that the purpose of diplomacy is to practice diplomacy, not to reach for force as an early or preferred option. Wars, he reminds the journalist, are far easier to start than to end. It is a message aimed not just at the interviewer, but at every capital around the world still tempted to treat military force as a quick solution to complicated problems. When the journalist counters that diplomacy is easy to praise when dealing with reasonable actors, but far harder when facing what she calls a dictatorship or an evil regime, Jaishankar responds with calm, unshaken composure. He acknowledges her viewpoint, states his own, and moves on. No anger, no lecture, just quiet, unshakable conviction. For decades, many Indians watching Western interviews of their leaders and diplomats have felt a familiar discomfort. A sense that Indian representatives were always placed on the back foot, always asked to justify choices that other nations are never asked to justify. Jaishankar flipped that dynamic entirely. Every trap set by the interviewer was calmly dismantled, not with anger or defensiveness, but with historical context, strategic logic, and a quiet confidence that comes only from decades of hard-earned diplomatic experience. What made the moment resonate so deeply was not aggression. It was clarity. Jaishankar did not need to raise his voice to make his point. He simply refused to accept flawed premises, one after another, and offered India's own logic in their place. This is what modern Indian diplomacy under the current leadership increasingly looks like. Firm, unapologetic, grounded in national interest, but never rude, never dismissive of the questioner as a person. It is a style that has become something of a signature for Jaishankar himself, and increasingly for India's broader global posture. Step back from this single interview, and a larger story becomes visible. For decades after independence, India's foreign policy was often described using terms borrowed from others, non-alignment, developing nation, third world. These were useful concepts in their time, but they also carried an implicit modesty, a sense that India was still finding its place in a world shaped primarily by Western and Soviet power centers. Today, that framing has changed. India speaks of strategic autonomy, the deliberate right to build relationships with any nation on India's own terms, judged purely by India's own national interest. Not driven by ideology, not driven by bloc loyalty, driven by what actually serves the well-being and security of 1.5 billion people. This shift did not happen by accident. It reflects India's growing economic weight, its expanding military capability, its deepening technological base, and a leadership that has consistently prioritized Indian interests over international image management. Jaishankar, as External Affairs Minister, has become perhaps the clearest and most articulate voice of this new posture, someone capable of explaining, in plain and confident language, exactly why India makes the choices it makes. The old assumption that India must explain itself to Western capitals is quietly dissolving. In its place is a newer, more confident posture. India will explain its reasoning when it chooses to, not because it is required to, and it will do so without apology. It is worth pausing here to compare Jaishankar's approach with how foreign ministers from other nations typically handle hostile Western media questioning. Many countries, when placed under this kind of pressure, tend to respond in one of two ways. Some become defensive, repeating rehearsed talking points without directly engaging the substance of the question. Others become combative, treating every difficult question as a personal attack, which usually only fuels the negative headline the journalist was hoping to write in the first place. Jaishankar does neither. He listens fully to each question, acknowledges the underlying concern where it is fair, and then dismantles the flawed assumption hiding inside it, usually with a historical fact, a comparison the journalist did not expect, or a simple reframing of the entire premise. This is not improvisation. It is the product of a lifetime spent inside the machinery of international relations, first as a career diplomat posted in Washington, Beijing, and Tokyo, and later as the person shaping India's foreign policy at the highest level. Foreign policy analysts across India have pointed to interviews like this one as evidence of a broader shift in how the country projects itself abroad. Where earlier generations of Indian diplomats sometimes appeared cautious or apologetic on international television, Jaishankar has built a reputation for turning even the most hostile interview into an opportunity to explain India's worldview clearly, calmly, and on India's own terms. This matters more than it might first appear. In an age when a single viral clip can shape global public perception faster than any official statement, having a spokesperson capable of holding his ground under pressure without losing composure or credibility has become a genuine strategic asset for the country. Looking ahead, interviews like this one are unlikely to remain rare exceptions. As India's economy continues climbing toward becoming one of the largest in the world, and as its strategic weight in regions from the Indo-Pacific to West Asia continues to grow, the scrutiny from international media will only intensify. That scrutiny is not necessarily a bad thing. A rising power should expect tougher questions, not softer ones. What matters is how those questions are answered. The patterns seen throughout this interview, patience without weakness, firmness without hostility, and a constant grounding in verifiable national interest rather than emotional reaction, offers a template that future generations of Indian diplomats will likely study closely. There is also a broader lesson here for how nations in the global South engage with legacy Western media narratives more generally. For decades, many developing nations accepted a kind of built-in disadvantage in these exchanges, allowing Western frameworks and assumptions to define the terms of every conversation. Jaishankar's approach suggests a different path. Engage fully, answer honestly, but never accept a flawed premise simply because it was asked with confidence by someone holding a microphone. As India continues to expand its voice on platforms ranging from the G20 to the United Nations Security Council reform debate, this style of calm, fact-based, unapologetic diplomacy is likely to become one of the country's most recognizable exports, arguably as influential in shaping global perception as any single trade deal or defense agreement. This interview will likely be remembered less for any single headline it produced and more for what it represented: a shift in tone between India and the wider world. A journalist arrived expecting a guest who would defend India's choices nervously, seeking approval. Instead, the world witnessed a seasoned diplomat calmly correcting flawed assumptions, exposing double standards, and reframing every difficult question through the lens of India's own long-term interests. No raised voice, no hostility, just quiet, unmistakable self-assurance, the kind that only comes from a nation that finally knows exactly where it stands in the world. The age of India explaining itself to please others appears to be ending. In its place stands a nation and a diplomat, simply stating the truth as it sees it, clearly, calmly, and without apology. If this gave you something to think about, share it with someone who needs to see this. Like, subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.